Dear colleagues, dear friends, good evening. Gal Hertz is one of those messengers you just heard about. A man who makes things mishappen. So a proper messenger, and indeed, and I'm delighted, Gal, that you started this evening. Marhaba and Ahlan Salan to our friends and colleagues who are sitting with us here. We are very much delighted to welcome our dear friend and colleague, Vivian Liska, Professor of German Studies at the University of Antwerp, who also serves as the Director of the Institute for Jewish Studies at Antwerp, acting in recent years, also as a distinguished guest professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which is part of this deal, I think, part of being here, right? And Vivian, you all know, is a scholar of great merits and wonderful deeds. We all appreciate so much, and being thankful for her generosity as a thinker, a scholar, a friend. She shares with us many different issues of joint interest. First and foremost, in her devotion, I would say, for critical inquiry of the so-called legacies of German Jewish literature and thought, studying carefully the crucial affinities of literary studies and theo-political tradition and more. Perhaps one may say Vivian too is on a search for new angels. In a recent book titled German Jewish Thought and Its Afterlife, she returns to examine the idea of tradition and transmission, right? It's Masoret and Mesira, it's Überlieferung, right? It's the very idea of tradition being in act. In the writings of Hannah Arendt and Gershom Scholem, and to investigate the issue of the law and the act of writing in Franz Kafka. She recalls in her book the messianic figure and the demonic in Walter Benjamin and Gershom Scholem, asking about the faculties of exiles and the being of strangeness in Paul Celan, Ingeborg Bachmann, and Jacques Derrida. Vivian returns to study how German and Jewish writers of modernity, or put better, Jewish and German authors of European modernism, engage the crisis of tradition and the void of revelation, and follows their methods of writing in a world from which the divine messenger seems long to disappear. In her book, she learns how German Jewish authors gave an expression to the loss of liturgical knowledge, dealing also with the crisis of language and the anxieties of the law, also in its implications, halacha, a Jewish law. You know, there's so much should be said about difference between law and halacha, but not in a moment. Alongside the experience of exile, in which, however, traces of messianic hopes, absurd ones, are still to find. Yet, and we just heard about that, a great part of her book is devoted to a review, a critic, of major readings and receptions of German Jewish writings by contemporary authors, among them Blanchot, Agamben, Zizek, Badiou, Jeffrey Hartman, Judith Butler, and Moshe Idel. Vivian looks closely how recent readers attempt at creating, imagining, saving a German Jewish legacy, yet in method, right, in ways of reading, based also and too often on selective readings, reconstructions or misinterpretations of text and of context, neglecting or overstressing in both terms certain moments and dynamics, movements of this literary corpus. She shows how major readers continue to neglect the complexity, the double implication, and even more ironies of Jewish traditions being in act in German Jewish writing. She signifies well in what sense those readers provide strong, creative, productive interpretations, yet often unfaithful to the complexity of the matter, like productive interpretations, however, based on misinterpretations of the messianic idea in Benjamin, his understanding of exile and translation, or the portrait of the angel and the nature of his melancholic thesis or burden. What her book aims at, however, is not a corrective attempt or an orthodox reading of the German Jewish tradition itself. Apological one, right? It's not the term that Vivian offers us, a kind of return to original kind of understanding the German Jewish moment. It rather search perhaps for a conversation, a critical dialogue, a radical one, through which the German Jewish tradition should be engaged anew, being brought into actualization. The chapters in Vivian's book should be read, if I'm right, as gestures of conversation. She recalls German Jewish authors and their contemporary readers into a whirlpool, a marbolet, right? A dance of thoughts and acts of translation in which, in somewhat, the former and the later are brought together, for it says, En mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. Right? This is also to notice. This book is perhaps, in its very formation, a continuation, in its very nature, of a modernist thought that is short and cut, fragmented, wounded perhaps, yet of strong and evidential presence. Right? So one could speak, after reading a book again, about the fragile validity of the fragment in German Jewish writing. So something of the fragment in your own book. Vivian's book doesn't suggest us a great narration or solutions concerning the German Jewish legacies, but rather she offers minor intervention, close readings, inviting us as readers to join her and to participate with her in critical conversations. A project is of value also because of its effort gathering males and feminine writers and readers through and beyond the gender difference, right? It's something which is, sometimes neglected in its very essence. Calling them into a self-critic. In doing so, the very concept of legacy being still dominated by the imaginations of father and sons, right? Me'avot lebanim. By reflecting or as being only reflections of some kind of Oedipal order, or by collective entities of conservative assertions, is being questioned. So the formation of the book, the kind of conversation Vivian offers us, is called into question the Oedipal order of tradition, in that case, German Jewish one. Vivian and a few of you already familiar with the Critic often being addressed in gatherings of German Jewish scholarship for the lack of reorientation in our field of studying. We know the Critic, right? As if we continue to ask all questions in a way that every so often neglects the needs and urgencies, the turning points of the present, but rather seeks to continue a path that leads into theoretical and political zones of comfort or dead ends. We know the Critic. German Jewish literature and thought is one of the major fields of the humanities. Turns, however, in many cases conservative, in other cases pseudo-radical. The actualization of this tradition demands a careful attention, a new accent, better questions, new ones, and thoughtful method of engaging its historical weight. This seems first necessary concerning the issue of tradition itself, as this was perhaps one of the great achievements of German Jewish writing, not alone lamenting the break with tradition and mourning its permanent crisis, but rather revealing and saving its leftovers as foundation for future thinking. German Jewish authors such as Benjamin, Kafka, Eliezer Schüler, Scholem, Rosenzweig, and Buber signify different methods to deal with Jewish and Christian tradition. They brought us back to read Talmud, Midrash, Kabbalah, and biblical texts in a creative way, somewhat progressive, deconstructive, both critical and normative. Right? Both critical and normative. How should we ask ourselves time and again, how should we and can respond to this challenge? It's left for us, right? A challenge. How to continue a deconstructive yet productive, both critical and normative way of dealing with tradition. As I think it's one of the questions Vivian deals very seriously in her book. The Jewish authors, however, often failed and we know that, into Orientalist view, and too often neglect the Arabic and the Muslim traditions, for instance, which were ever since interwoven in these realms of knowledge. Once we return to study their texts, asking on legacies, especially today, especially here, we are now allowed to ask properly the questions of tradition, not without Islam, for instance, not without the inversions of Hebrew and Arabic. Another issue, which is being dealt and addressed in Vivian's books very well, is the issue of exile, right? You ask the question again. What is the meaning or implications of thinking exile today? In what sense we remain faithful to the dynamics of exile thinking of the 20s and the 30s? Because it's not only a major notion in German Jewish thinking, but also it's becoming, for recent readers, an exemplar. Not to say, in some cases, false metaphor of Jewish existence. How should we reframe the concept of exile? In what language should we speak it out? Once we return to ask about the implications of exile in German Jewish writing, we recall, of course, the Jewish experience of the 1930s, echoing also narrations and myths of exile in post-biblical writings. Today, however, we cannot do so without recalling the Palestinian exile, giving attention to the refugees from Africa who are gathered today on the borders of Europe, and Hebrew too. This experience of exile demands revisiting and even inversions of what is being Jewish. Without those critical inversions, so it's not about ironies at all, right? It's into a deep political, cultural work that we are ready to do. Without those critical inversions of a German Jewish tradition might itself be fallen into dogmatic, self-affirmative view, something I think that Vivian's book reminds us how to think into the progressive moments of tradition. It reminds us to search for new engagements, to look carefully, to study critically the achievements and the failure of this tradition, and to bring this again into conversation. Let us conclude, however, with a minor remark on another great question posed in Vivian's book. The question regarding the figure of the angel and its counterpart, the demon. And you know, all people sitting here, I know you are already convinced that there is nothing that is more real than dealing with the existence of angels and of demons, right? The real is there. As we learn from Ibn Sina, Humanities, and Thomas Aquinas, the angels exist, right? Malachim nimtzaim, it's clear. In her book, however, Vivian discussed brightly those figures in Benjamin's and Sholem writing as they embody not only power of destruction and of redemption, visions and prophecies, but being themselves messengers, agents of tradition, transmitter, translators too, and therefore figures of literary studies. However, the angel is long out of the picture, right? Should we call him back? And how, right? And now? Once we call the angel to return, won't he send us his demonic double instead? The angels, we recall, are awful indeed. Jeder Engel sei schrecklich, right? We recall those lines from Rilke. They pay no attention to us. Yet the angels, as we know from the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions, had double missions. They were governors, men of court, but also served as singers in great chorus of heaven. The angel gathered in great hierarchies before God's throne, singing poems of praise and of lament. Yet, since long, they turned silent. Or did we forget how to listen? In her book, Vivian shows how often readers of Benjamin went wrong in false attempts, asking the old questions again regarding the origin of the angel. Angelos Novus, of course, the new angel, known also as the angel of history. So it's both like the gravitas and the akut in the same figure, right? He is new, but he is of history. For the being of the angel is yet to come. His name tells us. The origin of this angel is what we call the new. His past is the future. Not only because of its eschatological visions or because of the redemptive power he seems to lose and to recover during his terrible flight. This new angel belongs to the future. It is also its strangeness, its oddness, its unfamiliarities, its non-belonging, its anxieties and madness too, which are recollections of this time-space which is called the future. But not only because of that, this figure is anew. Not only because of its demonic nature, seems to cross all boundaries of gender and of sexus. It offers a post-humanistic view of being indeed, a one which not anymore and not only occupied by the natural history of destruction, but also by fears and hopes of human measure and beyond. What this angel embodies is far even from being a radical image of poetry itself. So even he goes even beyond that, in which all forms of expression are fallen into intensive, urgent, mad language. Again, is it this what we call the new? Indeed. And this is I think one of the conclusions of Vivian's book. Jews are allowed not to tell the future. It's slightly different, right? They are allowed not to tell the future. The future is what left untold. This, however, doesn't left them, which is us, too, only with an open, empty space, right? To be celebrated as a messianic becoming or of alterity as such, a cherut, but rather it turns into witnessing of a time not yet of us, in which fears and hopes are not for us alone, right? This perhaps is another message of the angel. It tells us something, right? Perhaps it tells us to let him free. Let him go. Calling him no back. We thank you, Vivian, right, for calling us through this book, offer us to join a conversation.